Reality TV takes this one step further by incorporating the viewer into the art itself. Not the viewer as they are, mind you, but a twisted, abstracted representation of the viewer. The viewer. TM. In reality TV, a core part of the entertainment is the fact that the actors know that they're being watched, but they don't know who is watching them, or maybe even what country the show will be broadcast in. The viewer TM that actors on set interact with isn't the actual person on their couch, but, say it with me now, an abstract representation of the person. Because the actor on the show that the person is watching isn't actually themselves, but rather an abstract representation of themselves. Fisher refers to this feedback loop of reciprocal abstraction as a control circuit, and observes that they are present throughout neoliberal capitalism. Hello and welcome to Simply Radical, your personal ticket to understandable radical left-wing theory. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll stick around for a bit. Most of my videos here are summaries of books written by authors better informed than me, from an MLM perspective. Sometimes I also make videos about specific ideas or events. If you've got a suggestion for me, please drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for y'all's feedback. If you want to keep up to date with my latest videos, go ahead and click that subscribe button below, and if you're a freak, you can even click the bell icon for notifications. Alright, without further ado, let's get this shit show on the road. Another example of these circuits can be seen in the new kind of neoliberal bureaucracy. Have you ever had a problem with Amazon and had to talk to customer support? If you haven't been cursed with such an experience, let me summarize it for you. The Amazon employee is not able to actually do anything of substance, and instead needs to interpret and follow a set of elaborate instructions given to them from on high. To the user with the problem, the Amazon employee is merely an abstract representation of the company TM, while to the Amazon employee, the user is nothing more than an abstract representation of the public TM. Neither are able to actually change the real world in any way, and so they engage in an endless circuit of talking past one another as nothing more than representations of a greater abstract whole. Using the terminology of Lacan, Fisher refers to the abstract whole as the big other. While this may be annoying and rage-inducing for the user, it is entirely soul-crushing for the Amazon employee. Let's explore why. When neoliberalism removed the middle managers who used to do bureaucracy and forced that task onto the workers, it brought with it the gaze of the big other, unblinking and at all times staring at the worker. The constant surveillance and auditing of workers, which was once the product of an annoying middle manager named Mort that came by every month, is now an all-consuming, unavoidable, and constant facet of work. There are no days when you're not being watched. There are no days when you're not being evaluated. There is no escape. As you might imagine, this creates an inescapable anxiety. The same anxiety that notorious French PDF file and philosopher, I know, shocker, Foucault discussed in his book Discipline and Punish. When confronted with that level of surveillance, you must constantly act as if you're being observed, which then in turn negates the need for being watched in the first place. This allowed employee surveillance, from the job of middle managers and bureaucrats, to be effectively forced onto the working class themselves. This effect is also further compounded by the previously mentioned divide between the quality of work and the perception of the quality of work, and the unofficial standards mentioned before that. These three issues work together in a perfect late capitalist wombo combo to create a scenario where workers are constantly setting higher and higher targets to make themselves look better, while also assessing their performance as worse than in reality, all the while worrying about what their supervisor might potentially say about all of these. By splitting our reality in two, through the use of various artistic techniques and economic incentives, namely reality and the perception of reality, and then shaping that perception through neoliberal ideology, workers have in effect been forced into exploiting themselves for the benefit of someone they've never met and never will meet. Under neoliberalism, workers are both worker and capitalist, but receive the benefits of neither. If you were to mention this to a coworker without first doing the legwork I've done here, they're liable to say something along the lines of, work smarter, not harder, or be realistic, there is no alternative. Keep these responses in mind as we move into discussing labor disputes under neoliberalism. Being realistic used to mean conforming to a common, solid reality. That's the kind of thing the silent generation would tell the boomer hippies in the 1960s when they made pie-in-the-sky claim that the US actually didn't need to invade a small coastal nation on the other side of the globe. Now that reality has been split in two, the real world on one hand and our perception of reality on the other, be realistic means to conform yourself to that perception, something that is constantly in flux. By way of example, Fisher told an anecdote about a manager he once had. He asserted with full confidence a story about the college knowledge in its future one day, what the implications of the inspections were likely to be, what senior management was thinking, then literally the next day would happily propound a story that directly contradicted what he had previously said. There was never a question of him repudiating the previous story. It was as if he only dimly remembered there ever being another story. This, I suppose, is good management. It is also perhaps the only way to stay healthy amidst capitalism's perpetual instability. To act in such a way, there is no room for critical thought, and a demand for constant submission to any and all bureaucratic authority. This compliance must also be cynical, though, with an internal hatred for the bureaucracy that we meekly submit to in real life. A key part of maintaining this cognitive dissonance is the creation of internal personal narratives that at the same time explain reality and also allow us to paint ourselves as the hero of the story in all situations. These narratives, as with reality, are constantly in flux and always contradictory, so, quote, forgetting becomes an adaptive strategy. Memory, or lack thereof, has become a cultural point of anxiety, as you might see in the likes of the Bourne films, or Memento, or The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and so on. These movies are often accompanied, especially in the Bourne films, by a cutting style that doesn't so much follow the plot as it follows the characters, in a, quote, continuous present. This, Fisher asserts, is reflective of the experience of being alive under neoliberal capitalism. Bourne's continuous physical reflexes and tics serve to represent the constant nostalgia that such a constant present creates. It also serves to represent a constant referencing and engagement with the past without ever really understanding it. In Memento, the memory issues might even be a better comparison. In this movie, Leonard is unable to create new memories, which makes all news seem hostile, fleeting, and unnavigable. Each time one of us experiences these feelings, we're pushing at the outer boundaries of capitalist realism, experiencing the little cracks in the glass of our cultural atmosphere. If we were to look to the other extreme, to the smoothest part of capitalist realism, the model that best exemplifies it would be a concept called dream work. No, not the Shrek studio. Dream work is a word that originates with our buddy Sigmund Freud, but which in this context means something very different. Fisher uses it to mean simply work that is performed while in a dreamlike state. When dreaming, we forget, but we also, like Joel in The Eternal Sunshine, forget that we've forgotten. This process of memory reset allows the internal narratives that we build to paint over the contradictions that we've encountered in real life, before then allowing us to forget that we've done so. Let's see it in action. Today, I was forced to stop performing my job and do a self-evaluation. That's my contradiction. But if I view it from my own narrative perspective, I was stuck doing something useless that I hate but I have to do for money, and then my shitty boss stopped me and made me do some other thing that's useless that I hated but had to do for money. Suddenly, there's no contradiction, and I'm free to forget all about having come across the contradiction in the first place. This doesn't just happen in our own minds, though. It also happens in our politics. Thanks to dream work, neoliberals and neoconservatives were able to work together for the better part of 30 years, despite entirely different political philosophies. Neoconservatives viewed themselves, through their dream work, as using the state to enforce strong Christian moral principles by destroying the social safety net, all while redirecting more money to the police and military. Neoliberals were able to do the exact same thing, hand in hand with the neocons, but by viewing it as getting rid of the, quote, nanny state and making society more quote-unquote meritocratic. Despite fundamentally opposed political philosophies, by thinking about their own narratives rather than reality, they were able to synthesize into one coherent movement. The hatred for central government in neoliberalism does more than unite its ruling class, but also provides fuel for capitalist realism more broadly. In the UK, both conservative and Labour governments have found that when privatized agencies fail, and they always do, the public is largely not angry at the private company that did the failure for the sake of profit, but at the government for having given up its control over that agency in the first place. In 2008, when the profit incentive, i.e. greed, drove capitalism into a tailspin that was easily foreseen and in fact previously banned before that ban was lifted by neoliberals, blame was laid at the feet of bad apples and the government for not having prevented it. Scapegoating an impotent and broken government not only allows the rich who actually commit these crimes to escape blame and consequences, but also allows the rest of us to avoid admitting that there are no controllers, that capitalism has pushed government to the side and taken the reins. Quote, the disavowal happens in part because the centerlessness of global capitalism is radically unthinkable. Although people are now consumers, and as Wendy Brown and others have pointed out, government itself is presented as a kind of commodity or service, they still cannot help but think of themselves as if they were citizens. The closest an average person ever comes with the centerlessness of capitalism is in a call center, which further reinforces the observation of our two realities. There is the official reality technology, TM, where services are provided smoothly and easily, and there is real life. Quote, the crazed Kafkaesque labyrinth of call centers, a world without memory, where cause and effect connect together in mysterious, unfathomable ways, where it is a miracle that anything ever happens, and you lose hope of ever passing back to the other side. Still though, thanks to capitalist realism, the shit of call centers never seems to be a consequence of capitalism itself, despite literally no other force being at play. I couldn't say it better than Fisher does here. The call center experience distills the political phenomenology of late capitalism, the boredom and frustration punctuated by cheerily piped PR, the repeating of the same dreary details many times to different poorly trained and badly informed operatives, the building rage that must remain impotent because it can have no legitimate object, since, as is very quickly clear to the caller, there is no one who knows, and no one who could know, and no one who could do anything even if they could. Anger can only be a matter of venting. It is aggression in a vacuum, directed at someone who is a fellow victim of the system, but with whom there is no possibility of communality. Just as the anger has no proper object, it will have no effect. In this experience of a system that is unresponsive, impersonal, centerless, abstract, and fragmentary, you are as close as you can be to confronting the artificial stupidity of capital in itself. In one pretentious term, the call center exemplifies negative atheology, or the constant search for a non-existent center that is, in the end, also not capable of exercising control. The centerlessness of capitalism also allows it, once laundered through capitalist realism, to escape culpability for systemic issues. Take recycling, for instance. You may have heard that all the ads we saw in the 90s and thousands that claimed that recycling is everyone's responsibility were made by the oil industry. They were, and it was not done out of the goodness of their heart, but because it contracts out responsibility for the impending climate collapse from the structure that did it to the consumer. This allows the structure itself, capitalism, to fade into the background. Such individualization also dilutes the imperative, because if every individual is responsible, then no singular entity is really to blame. The required subject, a collective subject, does not exist. Yet the crisis, like all the other global crises we're now facing, demands that it be constructed. In other words, because of the decentralization of capitalism, the model of individual responsibility assumed by most versions of ethics does not apply. Quote, does anyone really think, for instance, that things would improve if we replaced the whole managerial and banking class with a whole new set of better people? Surely, on the contrary, it is evident that the vices are engendered by the structure, and that while the structure remains, the vices will continue to reproduce themselves. Corporate higher-ups, by definition, cannot listen to and or take action that would embetter the world without completely going against the interests of the company and being removed. So, they dreamwork and narrativize. Quote, the delusion of many who enter into management with high hopes is precisely that they, the individual, can change things, that they will not repeat what their managers had done, that things will be different this time. But watch someone step up into management, and it's usually not long before the gray petrification of power starts to subsume them. It is here that the structure is palpable. You can practically see it taking people over. Hear its deadened/deadening judgments speaking through them. So if it's not the people who run the company that have the power, then what does? Quote, the ultimate cause that is not a subject, capital. Capitalism, as a system, equates hedonistic desire with personal interest, telling us that pointless and self-destructive purchasing and consumption is actually good for us. Just like spoiled children, it teaches us that what is best for us is getting whatever we want, whenever we want it. And just like children, our wants grow and grow over time until we are inevitably unable to satisfy them. Then, like a parent giving into a hysterical child demanding a new toy, capitalist realism refuses at all costs to challenge or educate us, telling us that perhaps we don't really need a fifth Stanley mug because we saw some influencer with one on TikTok. Instead, capitalist realism appeals to a certain idealized version of quote-unquote health to allow us to feel like we're taking care of ourselves. We're talking about the idealized, marketized girl boss self-care routines here, where the goal isn't actually to rest, recuperate, or recharge, but rather to post endlessly on Instagram about how many boxes we're ticking off on the hashtag bossbitch self-care checklist we screenshotted from whatever influencer is on our feed that week. Surprise, surprise though, that ideal of quote-unquote health actually has little to nothing to do with what is actually healthy. It's merely another societal standard to which to conform, so we can write the narrative that we're actually taking time to take care of ourselves. Something to advertise to others on social media about how unbothered, moisturized, happy, and in our lane we are, to reinforce, validate, and advertise the personal narrative we've constructed about ourselves. Something to keep us busy, so we don't actually ever stop and ask what is really in our best interests. And it really does stem from capitalist media pursuing profit. It's incredibly profitable to keep us in a constant media cycle that's at all times telling us how to feel about certain people, things, and concepts. Because not only do we get served ads between that propaganda, but increasingly, our content comes infused with corporate propaganda from the get-go. Such a media ecosystem is enough to make someone quit entirely. And that's where capitalist realism steps in with the hashtag bossbitch self-care checklist. You don't need to disengage, you just need to engage with a different influencer, with marketing focused on quote-unquote self-care. Don't look away from the screen. If that doesn't work for you, we'll serve you some inflammatory content about the new Kendrick Lamar diss track. Drake is suing him for PDF file accusations. Don't you feel something about that? By and large, the morality of previous generations that guided them to really authentically care for themselves and their communities has been replaced by feelings. Individual feelings are easy to cultivate, easy to manipulate, and easy to turn into a tool to keep you coming back for more. Don't you feel like K-Dot absolutely demolished Drake? How do you feel about this second diss track? Oh shit, Drake's now being a cowardly little baby boy and hiding behind a lawsuit because Kendrick just completely demolished everything he stands for? Surely you feel something about that. But these feelings don't actually contribute to anything. They don't bring you closer to your friends and family, they don't inform you about anything that's really worth knowing, they don't help you understand who you are as a person and what you really need. In fact, they isolate you from all of those things. They trap you in a never-ending media bubble of constant feeling that encourages you to open up your wallet so the owning class can vacuum it out. Quoting Fisher, "In the empire of the self, everyone feels the same without ever escaping a condition of solipsism, isolation. What people suffer from is being trapped within themselves. In a world of individualism, everyone is trapped with their own feelings, trapped within their own imaginations." Fisher wrote this book in 2009, and so much of his analysis has touched on movies and TV and so on, but he did acknowledge that this process was increasingly exaggerated by the advent of the internet, and I would argue that it has even gone so far as to be mostly facilitated by the internet nowadays, because not only does it isolate us from our communities, from actual reality, but the internet, and especially social media, also gathers us together in false, globe-spanning communities, where we can reinforce this process among ourselves. The biases that capitalist media imprints on us are then confirmed by others who have also undergone the same indoctrination, and we end up participating in our own isolation and propagandizing as we delve farther and farther into our online echo chambers. Now, if you're a soulless ghoul, you might ask, well, why is this a problem with the media itself? They're just giving people what they want. Well, like we touched on earlier, the cultural atmosphere of capitalist realism teaches us to act like spoiled children, pursuing vain and hedonistic wants rather than stopping to ask what we actually need. Certainly, this issue didn't begin with capitalist realism, but it 1000% does exaggerate, reinforce, and reproduce that mindset at every turn. Simply put, people often don't really know what they actually want. Often literally, like in the case of the widespread deep-rooted want to abolish capitalism that the vast majority of people have, but refuse to acknowledge due to cultural indoctrination. But it is often as simple as people not being well-versed enough or informed enough to articulate what they really want. Sometimes people don't know enough about a certain art form to tell you exactly what they like. If I don't know what Impressionist painting is, I can have a vague idea of the kind of painting I like, but I don't have the words to tell you that I really enjoy the short, quick brush strokes that are often applied heavily and globule-like. So, no matter how much I love Impressionist painting, when a company does the market research, it will never come back reflecting what I really want. These kinds of wants can only be provided for by institutions that are willing to create art that may end up not being profitable. Institutions like the BBC, Channel 4, or PBS. There's a reason Doctor Who ended up having such a massive impact on British and then global culture, and it wasn't because the BBC was pursuing profit. They made something that people liked, whether or not they could have said that they'd like it beforehand. For another example, look to Soviet cinema. Andrei Tarkovsky was a Soviet director active throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and if you've heard his name, it's because he's widely regarded, even in the capitalist hellhole of the US, to be one of the best directors of all time. His work directly inspired dozens, if not hundreds of franchises in the West. Alien, Blade Runner, and Star Wars all cite Tarkovsky as a direct influence, only to name a few. That was part of a much wider trend in Hollywood at the time, where Soviet cinema was highly regarded and used both as an explicit and implicit inspiration. And why was it so impactful? Because it wasn't trying to give people what they wanted, it was trying to give them what they didn't know they wanted. Okay, now we're beginning to reach the end, and Fisher has given us almost too much to think about in terms of criticizing our society. But we're not on the left because we want to sit inside staring at the wall and thinking about how shitty modern media is. What should we do? Well, Fisher starts with a classic. Just like Lenin said, in different words, in my last video, the overarching goal of the left needs to be to subordinate the state to the general will. But, Fisher argues, in order to do that, we need to resuscitate the concept of a general will, which has gone dormant under neoliberalism. Capitalist realism tells tells us that it doesn't exist, but I would caution us not to listen to something that directly benefits from the denial of its existence. The Great Recession that followed the 2008 crash ended the mass delusion that neoliberalism worked for common people. It's still around, of course, but it's dying. There is an opening in our culture for a new ideological project, and we need to make sure that it's ours. The left needs to look forward to the building of a new progressive project, not back to reclaiming old, failed projects. Since the failure of the Soviet bloc, the left has been in a comfortable, marginalized space, content to criticize things without providing solutions. Time to abandon that position and propose action. The left needs to be renewed, energized for something new, and not returning to the old ways that, again, have already failed. Our project needs to rival capitalism and capitalist realism, rather than reacting and responding to it. Rather than looking to undo capitalism, quote, anti-capitalism must oppose capital's globalism with its own authentic universality. In terms of concrete positions, Fisher sketches out a few guidelines based on his critique of capitalist realism so far. One of the best rhetorical positions we can take is the one of anti-bureaucracy. The left can actually and meaningfully deliver the destruction of the call center experience, in the way that neoliberalism promised and then failed to deliver. Workers must also be given their own autonomy, away from the auditing and surveillance of neoliberalism. We already do the work on our own. Now the left can make it comfortable. The left should also reject some forms of labor entirely, like the aforementioned bureaucracy and self-auditing. If it doesn't need to be done, we don't need to do it. The left also needs to reevaluate some of its older tactics that don't work in a new world. Fisher gives the example of teacher strikes, which end up hurting mostly the students who attend, while management, in his experience, mostly just takes the opportunity to save on labor costs. Instead, focus on things that primarily hurt management. For instance, refusing to cooperate with audits or self-evaluations while continuing to teach. Lastly, but certainly not least, Fisher, who tragically ended up going on to be a victim of the mental health issues imposed on him by capitalism, passionately advocates for the demedicalization and politicization of mental health. Not only because that is actual reality, but because it can be used as an effective organizing tactic. Quoting the text, "Affective disorders are forms of captured discontent. This disaffection can and must be channeled outwards, directed towards its real cause, capital." And now we've reached the end. I'm going to leave you with the last paragraph of the text, because I don't think I could summarize it all better than our author did himself. The long, dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction, which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again.
If you're new to this, let me know how I did. Does this make any sense at all, or are you more confused than you were before? If you're old to this, let me know what you think I missed, and leave your reading recommendations in the comments. If you've somehow made it to the end of this monster video, and would like to see more communist content, please negate the algorithm's distaste for progressive revolutionary content by liking and subscribing, and maybe tossing a link or two to a bud, preach. Lastly, but most importantly, the views expressed in this video are solely those of the book's author,
Mark Fisher,
and do not necessarily reflect the views of the video creator. It has been made solely for educational and entertainment purposes, and the creator does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy, applicability, fitness, or completeness of the content within. Please don't hurt me.